Hello, fabulous students. Today we have a screencast on President Gerald Ford. So, as always, our objective is to study this person. So, hopefully, we can reflect on his presidency and American times and hopefully do a little bit better in the future. Cultivate some life lessons. So, we're going to see. Let us go. So, starting off, his story, of course, is complicated, and it starts in the great state of Michigan. In 1932, he went to the University of Michigan, became a great Division I football player. He actually got two national titles for those college football fans. He was part of that dynasty. But he graduates, and he actually had the ability to go to the professional Lions or the Green Bay Packers, two of the oldest NFL teams, and he wasn't interested. Clearly, out of every president we've had, Ford is the most athletic. That's kind of his trivial contribution to the group of presidents. But anyway, he gets to 1941. And he's like, well, what do I do now? I'm not going to become a professional football player. I don't even think they wore helmets at that point. Or maybe they were just leather. But in 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and that gives him a sense of duty. He signs up for the U.S. Navy. And to be president, again, a lot of people debate on whether you should have military service. Most presidents have had military service up until most recently. But that's it. So he serves the U.S. Navy. That shows a little bit of his patriotism. It's going to help him out later. And then the war ends, of course. And he's like, what do I do now? Well, he was a Republican. He's like, Republicans like to help people. So he decides to go into Congress. There he can pass laws to support and help people, right? So he goes into the House of Representatives. That's the lower house, 435 members, or at least eventually. And he gets elected in 1948. That was a lot of people got elected at that point. That's about the time where Nixon and Kennedy joined the ranks of our legislative body. And he gains power over time. And when he gets to 1963, he has a great reputation. And Kennedy gets assassinated. They put together this commission to try to figure out what actually happened. Was there a conspiracy? Or was it just Lee Harvey Oswald? They're going to call this group the Warren Commission, a kind of a notorious group. They're going to study this issue for months, and Gerald Ford was on it. The arrow should be a little bit to the left, I would say. And people are highly critical of the Warren Commission because they said it was just Lee Harvey Oswald. A lot of people are conspiracy theorists, so he's part of the group maybe that didn't deserve some trust. I'm not sure. But either way, he was on it. In 1964, he actually gets a new job within Congress. Now, the House of Representatives is filled with two major teams. That's the Democrats and Republicans. And they battle. And of course, when you battle, you need a coach to kind of direct the efforts leadership-wise. And the coaches of the two teams are called the majority leader and the minority leader. These are kind of the most powerful leaders in the House. There's another position called the speaker, but basically minority leader versus majority leader, the two major people. And he's minority leader because he is the head of the Republicans, and they were the smaller party at the time. So his job is basically to go after the Democrats. And the leader of the Democrats at the time was the U.S. president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So he criticizes Johnson all the time. That's Ford. And particularly the Vietnam War and how he's handling it. And Johnson gets mad at Ford, doesn't like him. And he says some famous quotes. Gerald Ford has been playing too much football without a helmet. That's his way of saying he's stupid. Jerry Ford is so dumb he can't fart and chew gum at the same time. Lyndon Johnson basically made fun of Ford and kind of convinced the American people that Ford was not the most intelligent guy ever. So that's definitely going to stick with Ford and become kind of his reputation. So anyway, whatever, that's going to matter later. But in 1968, Johnson gets destroyed by the Vietnam War. Robert Kennedy becomes the next person that might take over the country, but he gets assassinated and killed. And as a result, Nixon and Spiro Agnew get elected in 1968. They become presidents in 1969. So the Republicans are back in charge. Now, we have studied Nixon in previous screencasts, and these are all things Nixon did, which are, good things, of course. But ultimately, in 1973, the Nixon administration takes a turn for the worse. So Nixon's vice president for all of that time, about 5 years, is a guy by the name of Spiro Agnew, former mayor of Maryland. Governor. Now, he gets a little bit of trouble. As governor of Maryland, he has to hire tons of companies to build things, and he kept hiring companies only if they bribed him or gave him kickbacks. Now, that's going to be at least reportedly over $268,000 that Spiro Agnew got in bribes or kickbacks that we know of. So, we're talking envelopes of cash coming into the White House. He also didn't pay taxes on it, which is $29,500, which is tax evasion, a major crime. So ultimately, they're going to come after him and say, listen, you deserve to be in prison, but if you resign from the vice presidency, we will cut a deal and you won't have to go to prison at all. So they make a plea bargain and get him to resign. Ultimately, he has to pay a fine of $10,000, which is like nothing. And he's on probation really for the rest of his life. So this is Spiro Agnew basically acknowledging that. Ultimately, he is going to resign. And that was him resigning, saying, I'm innocent, but I'm going to resign for the good of the country. So, who will be the next vice president? We have a President Nixon with no vice president. Now, there's a little bit of history here. We have changed our Constitution 27 times as of today. The 25th time, the 25th Amendment, basically said when there is no vice president, the president gets to pick the new one and the House of Representatives gets to confirm. Now, this was kind of sparked by because in 1964, Johnson was president and we had no vice president because Kennedy had been shot, Johnson moved up, and so on. And that's a dangerous thing when you don't have a backup plan ready. So that said, the 25th Amendment was created, and so that means Nixon nominates and the House of Representatives confirms. Now, there is another aspect of the 25th Amendment in case the president gets disabled, but we're not going to talk about that now. So we, the Democrats, said we gave Nixon no choice but Ford. We said we would only confirm Gerald Ford to replace Spiro Agnew. Now, why did they do that? Because at this point, the Watergate scandal was looming, and the Democrats thought that eventually Nixon was going to be confirmed guilty and kicked out of office, and whoever they put in as the new vice president would become president. And they wanted to put a weak Republican into the presidency so they would be easier to defeat in the next election. So anyway, and Gerald Ford had a reputation for being stupid and weak. So on December 6, 1973, Vice President Ford gets nominated before that by Nixon and confirmed by the House and sworn in as vice president. 8 months later, Nixon resigns. Goodbye, President Nixon. Ford is now president, not vice president, but president. And here's his first. So that is Ford very famously, right after getting sworn in, as Nixon was probably crying, flying in his helicopter away. Our long national nightmare is over. He's talking about Watergate for over a year that was tearing our country apart. Is Nixon guilty? Is it not? The country looked terrible. So that was a good speech by Ford. Now, he's the only unelected president we've ever had. He got appointed to be vice president and then he became president. That's only possible if both a president and vice president get kicked out of office in some manner. And that, of course, happened. Spiro Agnew and, of course, Ford. So my question is, when the vice presidency is empty, should there be another election so that people can pick the new vice president, or should we continue to let the president and the House of Representatives handle it? Obviously, we want the people to have as much power as possible, but is this necessary or kind of like a one-time deal? So after Ford becomes president, who's his vice president, and he uses the 25th Amendment again, and this time brings in a guy named Nelson Rockefeller as VP. Not a whole lot of people know about him. He didn't really do much, but I just mean he wasn't that notable in the historical ranks. So what ends up happening to Nixon? Well, he's perceived as a criminal. Now that he's no longer president, he can actually be arrested for his crimes, and Ford pardons him. Yeah, a lot of people were upset with that because it didn't even say what Nixon did. Didn't even have to get Nixon to admit to anything or apologize. It was just a blanket pardon. So people are going to be upset. I mean, if you look here, what about justice? If I do something illegal, I have to go to prison. Now Ford pardons him. There's no justice. So justice died. This is corrupt. The accusation is Nixon picked Ford and made a deal. I'll pick you as my vice president if you can give me a pardon if I ever get impeached. So it sounds like a really corrupt bargain, so to speak. Now, why is this a good idea? Well, because Nixon was tearing the country apart. Everybody's debating about what should happen with him. People are fighting. Republicans hate Democrats. It's awful. Maybe our country just needed to put this behind us. He's suffered enough. We've suffered enough. Just Watergate, go away. We have to start healing and coming back together. That's why Ford claimed to have done it. And I mean, as a historian, I happen to believe him because this was tearing the country apart, and Ford just wanted us to get back to positive thoughts. And when it comes to the next election, Ford is going to lose. And a lot of people say this pardon was what did it. The American people wanted Nixon to be held accountable, and now they blamed Ford for this pardon. So it's going to matter. So should President Ford have pardoned Richard Nixon as an attempt to get the country to move past Nixon and Watergate? Or should Richard Nixon should have faced a trial, which would have dragged on for a couple of years and still kept this in the news? I don't know. Justice is important, right? So what did the American people think of Ford? Well, they did think he was clumsy. Here's an image of him skiing. He fell. Um, So again, Ford had a reputation for being clumsy and an idiot. President Johnson had kind of given him that. Here's Saturday Night Live, a comedy show that also made fun of Ford. So these are all Chevy Chase actor pretending to be Ford every Saturday night, just in regular situations, falling over his desk. So again, Gerald Ford later is going to talk about how he lost the election. He thought that Saturday Night Live and Chevy Chase making fun of him was part of it. So again, even decades later, Ford still has this reputation, right? The Simpsons and all. Poor Ford. He actually was like, I'm the most athletic president ever, and everybody thinks I'm an idiot and clumsy. Kind of weird. So there's going to be some losing going on, and he does blame Chevy Chase for perpetuating that image of him. So let's talk about the Ford presidency. He was only president for less about 2 years ish, a little less. So first thing, amnesty for draft dodgers. So the United States was in a 9-year war in the Vietnam War. Millions of young people served, and thousands of young Americans died. But others said, I'm not going to fight in this war. I'm going to burn my draft card. I'm even going to flee the country. I'm going to go to Canada, maybe even Sweden. So as of 1973, the war is finished. It's over. The troops come home and families get reunited, which is an amazing, awesome thing. However, there were people that couldn't come home, the draft dodgers that fled the country. The war's over, but if they come home, they betrayed their country. They did not serve. So if they came home, they would be arrested. They'd serve time in prison. So a lot of families are like, I want my son to come home. Families were broken up. You couldn't even see your child, right? So Gerald Ford thought this was bad, that we should put the war behind us, and said, how can I do it? So there's 210,000 draft dodgers, and he grants them amnesty, which is a blanket pardon. It's a form of forgiveness. It says, if you come home, if you commit to giving me 2 years of community service, 2 years where you actually serve your country, maybe by picking up trash or doing anything, we will forgive you and you don't have to go to prison, and so on. And many people in the country are angry. They're like, this is a terrible thing. They broke the law. They were unpatriotic. They burned flags. Other people sacrificed their lives. They served their country, and they just have to pick up trash. This isn't okay. But then again, some people are like, no, the war was immoral. We were napalming villages. It was awful. We weren't going to win. They didn't even want us over there. So this was a legitimate reason for people not to have wanted to fight. We shouldn't blame these draft dodgers. So, point of discussion: should Ford have offered draft dodgers the amnesty deal? Our country really, really disagreed over this, but Ford did offer it. Now, the second thing Ford was focused on was inflation. It was one of the worst periods in our history for inflation. It definitely rivaled in 2023 and 24 as well. So the inflation rate is typically hovering around, I don't know, 2 or 3% in our country's history. But it was high in the 70s, and in 1973, when Ford took over, it was 6%, then 11%. It's never been that bad. That's awful, or typically not. So inflation, it was bad. That meant everything cost so much more money. Everybody had the same amount of money, but now it could buy significantly less. People's savings were eaten up. They had less money because consumers had less money. They couldn't spend money. So that meant stores were losing money, and they would have to close down. Businesses would close down and fire workers. So the massive inflation was leading to a recession, our economy getting smaller. So Ford said, I'm going to do something about it. This is my number one threat. It says it's public enemy number one, and then comes up with a campaign called WIN, Whip Inflation Now. And he ordered like millions of buttons to be created. He wanted Americans to all wear it, and all Americans to come together, just like in World War II, to whip inflation. Now, how could Americans actually help with inflation? Well, inflation happens when there's an excessive amount of spending often. And so what Ford said was, well, we need to all plant more food in gardens. That way we have more food, the cost of food will go down. Let's turn down our thermostats so we use less oil, and then the price of oil will come down, which impacts everything, right? Because oil is used to make everything. Let's carpool, so we'll save oil, and therefore the price of gas will come down. You know what? Let's do a tax increase on the rich, and therefore they'll have less money. They can spend less money, and this is what we will do. And he wears a win button to try to get everybody to do this campaign. Now, the thing about it was, WIN was a total failure. Nobody followed it. Nobody voluntarily did these things like planting gardens and things like that. So there was no impact on inflation. Inflation was still just as bad, and people suffered. So my question for you is, should Ford have passed laws that required people to plant gardens, turn down their thermostats, carpool, rather than just asking people to do it? By asking people to do it, nobody did it. Should he have taken freedom away from Americans to more tangibly make a difference on inflation? Always a complicated subject. So either way, Ford unsuccessfully went after inflation. He did grant amnesty for draft dodgers. And then there was the Equal Rights Amendment. So let's talk about this. So there's going to be a massive number of protests in the 1970s during the Ford era of women, but also men, protesting, wanting women to have equal rights. So it's going to be them fighting for the ERA, which is a proposal to change our Constitution. So judge women as people, not as wives. So what was the Equal Rights Amendment? Well, we have a Constitution, and that Constitution basically allows women to be treated differently, and always has. So some people wanted to pass an amendment to say that you cannot treat women differently in any way. It started by Alice Paul, a famous civil rights leader, in 1923, where she said women are treated awful in a million ways, and I want to change our Constitution by passing an amendment. We have had 27 amendments passed, just not this one. And it said that everybody has to be treated equally based on sex or gender. So the amendment process to pass the Equal Rights Amendment is you need 2/3 of Congress to propose it and 3/4 of the states to ratify it. That's how you change the Constitution. Well, in the 1920s, it's going to fail. That's not going to happen because many Americans, or most, thought that women were the weaker sex and therefore needed protection, and therefore they needed better laws to protect them and to treat them differently. For instance, like laws that say that women can work less hours than men can. So that's why many people were against it. And some people just were sexist and didn't think women should be equal. So these are reasons why in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the Equal Rights Amendment was not passed. But in 1972, now the country has changed its mentality, a lot more equality-based, particularly after the Civil Rights Movement. So there are now protests again, and there's momentum and so on. And 2/3 of Congress does propose successfully the Equal Rights Amendment. It's been proposed. They now just need three-fourths of the US states to actually ratify. So that's a grand total of 38 out of 50 states. That's how many we need. And they miss. In the 1970s, only 35 states passed the Equal Rights Amendment, ratify it. They need 38, though, to make it the law of the land. And these states in red are the ones that say no, absolutely not. You can see predominantly, and many of them are the southern states, which typically don't want the federal government messing with their laws. They want to be able to make up their own rules, states' rights and all. Now, Phyllis Schlafly, I screw up her last name every single time. She was the biggest spokesperson for being against the Equal Rights Amendment. So she made that basic T-shirt famous, "Stop the ERA." So here's her speaking about it. So absolutely, Phyllis Schlafly, I can't even remember. They just said how to pronounce her last name. She basically said, "I want to preserve the family." This is an attack where it's going to change gender roles. Women are house mothers and they take care of children. They raise families, and that's really, really important. If they're expected to be equal with men, they're going to have to start working on a full-time basis, and that will tear families apart. You got to remember that women often didn't work prior to the 1970s, and she was against this changing. And the draft, she mentioned that women would now be forced to fight, and that wasn't what she thought was right. Also, divorce and child custody. Prior to the 70s, women typically were favored by courts. If there was divorce, women would get the control of children more often, and the men would have to supply them with money and support, and that was seen as a good thing. Alimony would be eliminated. What would happen is if there was a divorce, the ex-husband would have to provide a lot of money so that women and the families were taken care of, and that would go away, was her claim. There were extra labor protections for women because women were perceived as needing extra protections, and those would go away. And even there were arguments that we'd have to get rid of gender-neutral bathrooms, which is kind of ludicrous, but that was used. So again, she led that movement to stop this, and they did stop it. Ultimately, it had momentum to get passed and then fell 3 states short. So she also said it wasn't needed anymore, that women basically have equality in the 70s, and why do we have to do this anyway? So it never actually passes. So either way, my question is, are women different from men? And if so, because of these differences, should we occasionally have laws that apply to men and women differently? I think that's a valid question back in the 70s and maybe even today. So another question is, in terms of gender equality, are the American people better off letting each state make the laws, or by having the federal government make one law for everyone? So, I mean, this is that question here. Did we want the federal government telling everybody that they had to treat men and women equally? Or should the federal government pass an amendment and then order all the states to act in the same way? So what do you prefer? Who should have the power in society to decide our laws? Is it better that the local areas make our laws and therefore they might be different from state to state? Or should we have a federal government deciding what's right and just and making sure none of the states are abusive to their people, telling them what to do? A complicated question, right? So the Ford administration, amnesty for draft dodgers, unsuccessful campaign to handle inflation, equal rights amendment. While it wasn't up to Ford, he certainly did not get it to pass. And now we're talking the Helsinki Accords. So the Helsinki Accords were signed on August 1st. There's Ford with Leonid Brezhnev, the second longest leader of the Soviet Union. The objective was to decrease tensions, right? In the 50s and 60s, we were so close to nuclear war so many times that now Nixon and Ford want to decrease tensions to make the world more peaceful. And it's going to take place in Finland, and Ford's going to go there. 35 nations signed the Helsinki Accords, and we're going to learn a little bit about this treaty. So, what was causing the tension? Well, a big part of the tension were the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were conquered after World War II by the Soviet Union. They were incorporated into the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was 15 republics. These were three of them. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Of course, much of the world was like, you conquered these areas. They should be free. They should be their own country. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to leave them conquered? I mean, that makes the Soviet Union another Hitler. So if you look here, you can see that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are there free. And then after World War II, gone, conquered. And what is the U.S. going to do about it? There was an agreement that we should all band together to stop Hitler from conquering. Why not the Soviet Union? So the U.S. is putting pressure on the Soviet Union. That pressure is constantly leading to a potential war, a lot of threats and rhetoric. So that tension is not so good, maybe. Or maybe sometimes we need tension, who knows? So the Helsinki Accords did a lot of things, but what it said was we have to accept the territory borders of our enemy and stop protesting. If we stop protesting each other's land, that will decrease tension, right? So that was kind of something we agreed to. So we agreed to in the Helsinki Accords to do nothing. End the rhetoric about freeing those countries. So non-intervention, stop funding revolutions and movements to get those countries to be free. So it is true that this would decrease tension, but other people said, no, you don't want to decrease tension. You fight the devil. So either way, was this an example of appeasement? I think some people said yes. And ultimately, the final decision was Ford's, and he signed the Helsinki Accords and decided to appease the conquering of those three places. Now, we could have kept fighting, but that would have been dangerous, and Ford didn't want to do it. So I think this is both a good thing and a bad thing. It did ease tension and make nuclear war less likely. And so here they are. And, there's Ford on the left side clapping because now he did some good for peace. So should we have done more to free the Baltic states, or should we have prioritized easing tensions in a nuclear world? I don't know. So here we go. Ford, amnesty for draft dodgers, fought inflation, did not get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, and signed the Helsinki Accords. Another thing about Ford was he was for small government. In 1776, the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution and made three branches of government and created checks and balances to limit the power of the federal government and to make it less potentially interfering with our rights. Now, one example of this was they gave the president the veto power, and presidents used the veto to tell Congress, no, you can't do something. And ultimately, presidents use the veto power a lot, or not a lot, I should say. But Ford used it 66 times, and he was only president for like half the time, or even less. So he basically was telling the Democratic Congress, no, you cannot do these things. I want government to be small, and I want the government to do less for the people because I think small government is better. Mind your own business. Let people run their own lives. So the number one conflict here was Ford did not want the government taxing people a lot and then spending that money a lot. So he wanted lower taxes. Ford believed the government should be smaller, and so he kept vetoing the Democrat spending where the government was going to tax people and then help people. Democrats got angry with all these vetoes, and well, either way, my question would be, should the U.S. federal government be large, active, and expensive, or small, cheap, and inactive, and basically leave people to run their own lives? We know which side Ford was on, right? So in addition to supporting small government with his vetoes, Ford is going to go through some rough times. So that said, a couple assassination attempts. Yep. And so Ford, I mean, again, both of these assassins turn out to be women, which is very, very unusual, right? In a country where like about 98% of violent crime is committed by men. So here's one of the assassins, the first. So that was the first assassin. She did have some mental health issues and so on. But here's the second assassin, and she's interviewed here. Why I killed the president, or tried to anyway, Sarah Jane Moore. So there's Ford, and he's looking across because some struggle is going on. And there he is looking still, and there he is ducking, and that's when the bullet missed him, right? So there's the people trying to attack Sarah Jane Moore right there to prevent her from firing again. So either way, given that our country goes to war all the time for goals we believe in, we go to war and we kill people. Is it wrong for a U.S. citizen to kill a president for something they believe in when our country does it all the time? Fair discussion question. So either way, followed up, Sarah Jane Moore. So next, we have one more topic to talk about, the axe murder incident. So 1950 to 1953, there was the Korean War, right? 33,652 deaths. And so after that war, we created a demilitarized zone to basically prevent war from happening again. This is the area that the North and South and us share, and so on. And there's a little village called Panmunjom right on the DMZ, that middle spot where we're going to negotiate and so on. It's called the Joint Security Area, where we're both together, and this is where hopefully we make treaties and peace and so on. So there's conference rooms built right on the border so that we can negotiate peace and so on, negotiation tables. Now, before 1976, we actually in the entire village could go wherever we want. We didn't have to stay on our side of the border. It was a mixed area, and both sides had guard duty to make sure that everybody behaved themselves there. You can see what the yellow dots are. That's where the U.S. outposts were there, just to make sure everything was maintained well. So the loneliest outpost in the world, out of every place that the U.S. has people serving, is you can see there in the yellow. It's right on the border of North Korea, and it's right next to the bridge of no return. So basically, you go over that bridge, and that's exactly where North Korea is. I don't know if you want to spend long nights right next to North Korea, worried that they're going to sneak across the bridge and grab you. But anyway, the problem is that we couldn't see the loneliest outpost in the world because of these huge trees. And so we were worried they were going to sneak across and hurt our soldiers there, because there was always soldiers there. So our idea was to go in and trim up these trees so we could watch our guy and make sure he wasn't harmed. So again, so the U.S. did that. On August 18th, 1976, we're going to send some troops down, and they're going to have axes, and they're going to trim the tree just to make sure we can see that a little bit easier. But then North Korean soldiers came up, said, you need to stop. The tree cannot be trimmed because our leader personally planted it and nourished it, and it's growing under his supervision, which of course did not really happen. But that's what he said. So we ignore the order. We're like, whatever, we're going to trim this. I don't care what you're saying. So then the North Koreans show up with 20 more soldiers, and they say, stop now, don't touch this tree. And the US soldiers say, no, we're going to trim the tree. Sorry, you can't tell us what to do, even if you have a lot of soldiers with you. So that leader takes his watch off, covers it in his handkerchief, and then yells, kill the bastards. And that's exactly what they do. They take the axes and they hack and murder the US soldiers. Both leaders of the US get killed. Now, my question is, should the United States have gone to war over the axe murder incident, the killing of 2 US soldiers by North Korean soldiers? Well, Gerald Ford was wondering how he should react and says, I shouldn't be too strong. 2 of us are dead. I don't want to start a war that's going to get thousands of us dead. But I don't want to be weak. That's appeasement, and that will cause more aggression against us. So Operation Paul Bunyan is started. We moved 12,000 forces into Korea. So if we have to act, we can act. But these forces are ready to go, and they know that they're there. Hopefully that's enough. We have 27 helicopters flying over the DMZ. We have bombers flying overhead as well. We move an aircraft carrier nearby. We mine the bridge of no return so that we can blow it up if they try to bring troops over. And then we take 813 men specifically, and they go and they chop that tree down that we were trying to chop down at the beginning. And this is them literally doing that. And that's the result. We took down those trees. And now you can completely see the loneliest outpost in the world, right? So, and today there's a monument dedicated to the 2 lives of those people that died. So today now that area of Pamajan is completely segregated. Our soldiers do not interact to prevent things like that from happening again. They have to stay on their side of the wall. So ultimately, we've talked about Ford in lots of ways, but now we hit the election of 1976 after about 2 years of serving. And the election is going to be complicated. It's going to be Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, stepping up against Ford. Here's Ford debating Carter. Oh, and did not play. Excuse me, totally my fault. So ultimately, that's considered a gaffe. Ford made a huge mistake in this debate with Carter. He basically said Eastern Europe's not dominated by the Soviet Union. And of course, in 1956, Hungary had a revolution. The Soviet Union used their troops to crush it. In 68, Czechoslovakia did. And there are troops, Soviet troops in all the countries of Eastern Europe, basically telling them, you better do what I say. And so that seemed like Ford didn't know what he was talking about, that he truly was stupid and so on. So the 4 negatives was he pardoned Nixon. A lot of people didn't like the Republicans because of Nixon in Vietnam. It took forever to get out of there. A lot of Republican backlash over Watergate. He had a reputation for being stupid, and then he had that debate gaffe where he seemed stupid. Jimmy Carter seemed like a breath of fresh air. So Carter's positives was he was not a Republican. He was an outsider, so he wasn't somebody in Washington and people were getting sick of them. He was super religious, and that made him trustworthy. He was a man of the people. He didn't seem like a Nixon, like a god, and he seemed honest. And Carter's going to beat Ford, and that's going to be the end of the Ford presidency, although it was a close election, right? So why was Gerald Ford Gerald Ford responsive to the needs of the American people? And I mean, again, perhaps he was or wasn't. That's up for you to decide, but at least we know kind of what happened. So thank you so much for paying attention to the screencast on the presidency of Gerald Ford. Hopefully we've learned some lessons from his presidency and, of course, the decisions he was making.